introduction, my name is Claudia. I'll be chairing this round, but please refer to the panel as a whole. Joining with me from my left to the right.
What's up? Omesh, no preference.
Alice.
Pranav, good luck.
All right, let's now hear who will be speaking in this round, starting with OG.
Speaking first, RP, any pronouns? Very happy.
Speaking second.
Foster, he their pronouns, I speak first on all.
Shaya, ideally.
All right, closing government.
Aiden,
Elena.
NCO.
Eleanor Mabashita.
Maya Sheikha.
All right. Let me just put the timer on. Well, I put specific on kind of things. And we are very happy to call the Prime Minister to open this big audience. Please keep silence. If you want to cheer only between speeches. Let's go. The end. This is a recorded round, so if you do not consent, please stay with me for your speech.
Testing one. This I don't. Is this? Is this just recording for like the recording?
No streaming.
It's not a microphone. Oh man,
They're streaming,
they're streaming. Oh,
so that's the change.
streaming. Oh, I should have sent that to someone.
If you do not consent, very clearly state it to the streaming.
I'm good. I consent. We good. A quick thank you. Thanks Hard House for being here and supporting us. Your support means a lot to us. Thanks Canada for being, I don't know, I feel like an awesome regional contingent. We had a lot of fun, and I feel like whenever we come to Worlds, we come together as Canadians, and it's like one of the few times I can feel unabashed pride for my country. So that's really awesome, and thanks Adam for being a great partner. This has been a really legendary run. Never thought we were going to be here. Cool. As Nietzsche said, suffering is good. And I think that's a pretty simple stance, but is surprisingly difficult and nuanced to articulate. It requires a lot of delicacy in the way that you write characters, show their suffering, and how it develops them as a character, as a person, and teaches them lessons. And that's really important, because art is often where we learn our lessons, where we see people go through experiences, where we empathize with that character and live vicariously through them. Stories are the most powerful way to teach people and change their lives for the better. We think that we should have a world in which we have good written stories that provide good examples, not a cheap use of trauma plots that both cheapens traumas, spreads bad narratives, and ultimately normalizes a narrative of victimhood that takes people's agency away from themselves. Firstly, I want to talk about a characterization of what prominence looks like. I think the first element of this characterization is that there are just more trauma plots. And yes, there are more trauma plots as main plots, but crucially, there are more subplots that are being used that have elements of trauma in them. That's to say your villain or your main character or some side characters, all of them you often want to have a quick characterization of their backstory to make them relatable, to establish their motivations and make them feel real. And what's being used more and more frequently and almost ubiquitous across all media is trauma. Trauma is the reason your character has these motivations, hates water, doesn't want to do these things, etc., etc. It is a very quick way to convince your audience that this character is real and their motivations make sense. Yeah, sure.
What is the comparative on your side?
I'll get to that. Cool. And so the reason why this is the case, like the reason why it's used in these kind of like quick ways, is because a good trauma plot is kind of hard to develop. I'll talk about this later, but it takes a lot of time to show that character development, to really get into the weeds of the nuance, like how did they develop trauma? How did that affect them in specific ways in their character, you know? As opposed to just making broad generations, like, oh, they were affected by this bad thing, you know, like their family was killed and now they have trauma, so now they really hate everyone from this group, right? So good trauma is really hard to express. This other trauma, this subplot, it's very easy to throw in. It's very easy to justify to audiences, right? The second thing here, and I want to note that our mechs aren't dependent on this subplot thing, but I do think it's really useful. The second thing is the expectation of the trauma plot in story. So people have come now to expect, oh, this character needs to have some kind of trauma to make their motivations legitimate. Otherwise, they're just kind of preferences, and you know those aren't as deep or as powerful as trauma. That's the thing that kind of shapes your personality and your worldview. And if you don't have that, then you know now stories are feeling forced to incorporate trauma into their stories, even when it doesn't really fit, even when it doesn't make sense, because audiences come to expect that as a deep and meaningful, well-thought character. The comparative art side of the house is you still have success stories because people still want to write about their trauma. It's often their deepest personal experiences, and those art is an expression of those experiences. You still have projects that focus mainly on trauma as the main plot of the character, and so I think it would be hard for opposition to say, oh, you don't really get any kind of trauma. I think you still have some good examples, but what you don't get is this kind of wave of copycats in which you start putting it in everything because you see it as a useful and easy plot device. That's what our comparative is. First argument then, why do we think that trauma plots on op are done poorly? 2 reasons. Firstly, I think trauma plots are just hard to do well. You need a good writer that has personal experiences, not just with trauma, no thank you, but often with a specific kind of trauma that you're wanting to represent. And so the writer needs to have a lot of control over the story, what they need to happen, how long that story is, how much time they want to spend on things. And guess what? A lot of the media that people consume is under very tight budget constraints, but also constraints from higher up executives that want to just, you know, make sure the writer gets in things that are their cash cows. Ultimately, that means that writers don't have as much controls, and also there just aren't that many good writers that are so amazing that can write a great trauma plot, right? On our side of the house, those few writers who can do a really good job and do have support still write their stories. They're still excellent, right? You still have them. But the second thing is you need support as well. You need to have a great voice acting cast or a great acting cast to show those emotions well, to accurately represent those characters. These are also very difficult to get. There's not a lot of really talented people in the world, but also they are expensive to hire because they do a really good job. And so that is another constraint why. And the last thing I'll put here is just support in terms of like your institution or whatever media company is hiring to do this. They have to believe in a long trauma plot that takes up the majority of the story to be done effectively. If they don't think that's a good idea, they're not going to be able to do it. Second mechanism here is that often studio executives are just going to want to put in other things like fan service or action or just like broader plot resolutions that don't have to do with trauma, because those are the things that they know fans want to see. A trauma plot is not only difficult to write, but it's often very risky if you've spent all of your time on it. Maybe people don't relate to it because it's a deeply personal experience. Maybe people think it's cheap or it's not effective, it doesn't connect to them, in which case your thing spectacularly fails that you spent $160 million on. You know what is successful, you know what works, and often that isn't a deep trauma plot. It's a lot of really cheap things that you can throw in there and you know people are going to pay money to see. And so what this means is that trauma plots in the world of prominence, in the margin of this debate, the extra trauma plot you get on op is used as a low effort tool to establish motivations. It is surface level justifications, and you don't get the development that makes trauma plots genuinely valuable. What does this mean for art? One, you don't get character development often, right? Because again, resolving that trauma in a satisfying and good way takes time. Often it's a lot easier to have the tragic end and just kind of establish their motivations and end their story another way. But two, it means that you fall into overused tropes without innovating on them, right? Because again, those are things that are easy that people recognize. It's like a dog whistle. It's like when I say the word mechanism or like burden to you guys, you instantly know what that means. It's like, oh, I say like, this kind of trauma to them, and I use that trope. Audience instantly understands what that means. They can put together motivations, and you don't really have incentives to add nuance to that or challenge it because, again, it takes a lot of time and money. The impact of this is that you reinforce stereotypes, that people with trauma are like crazy, or that they like now have twisted motivations that in their world they're morally right, but to everyone else they're just like downright evil. Secondly, I think you just get very poor quality writing. Sure, POI.
Yeah, do you have an example of a show that has utilized the trauma plot unnecessarily and importantly with a harm?
Yeah, sure. So I think trauma plots get used I mean, like, I watch a lot of anime, so often the anime characters have like, oh, I had this tragic backstory where like my whole village was killed, and like, oh, I'm so traumatized, and then like, and then there's just now a character, right? So yeah, sure, cool. Second argument on the normalization of victimhood, right? So we model often ourselves from shows, and like, I know we're all like, oh, we're rational people, we know it's a show, but like, let's not pretend that we didn't like often parrot the lines from our favorite characters or see ourselves in them. This is often the way that we learned, right? This is the way that we interacted with the world. What does this do? One, it makes people feel like they have less agency in their lives, right? Like just in general, when you kind of view yourself as a victim of trauma, that's often something that shapes your personality, your decision, your motivation. It takes away agency from you, and it attributes your characteristics, your motivations, your preferences to things that happen to you. This is why we see often online so much like psychoanalyzing of like, oh, like this happened to me and that's the way I act in these ways. Oh, my mom was too harsh on me and that's why like I'm so fucked and I can't ever make myself happy, right? But I think this is worsened by the way that writers write trauma, right? Because it's hard to have an actual good resolution, but it's often sexy or edgy to have a tragic ending. The resolution of that trauma is often a tragic end. That trauma led someone to, die in the story or never meet their goals, and that is tragic, but beautifully so. But we think, again, that normalizes this idea of victimhood, that takes away people's power. I didn't write a second impact, but Adam will surely extend on this because he's my best friend. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'm very happy to call leader of the opposition. Here, here.
Oh yeah. Millions of people cannot recognize the abuse that occurs to them. They don't have avenues to talk about them and live in circles where talking about abuse and violence is inherently stigmatized. The prominence of trouble plots in media and art uniquely solves these problems. I'm incredibly proud to oppose. I'll give you two very clean pieces of material in this speech. The first thing I'll do, which is, by the way, 6.5 minutes of PM, is actually explained by the prominence of these media, of these trouble plots in media and art, necessarily means that they're done well, that they're nuanced, and are actual real depictions of what these subplots look like. And then I'll talk about the multitude of societal benefits we get in terms of recognition of abuse, in terms of you getting help, in terms of this being a uniquely comforting thing to you. Let's talk about why this is done well. Their comparative is, there are still some trauma plots on their side. It's just a few instances of trauma plot, and somehow that's better. I just want to point out they give you no reasons for why the kinds of writers that come up on their side are uniquely better at representing these things. But let me tell you why the increase in prominence is necessarily and inherently good. So the big underlying factor when you have the prominence of these things is that there's many different sources and lots of conversation, just more art being produced that talks about these trauma plots. The first observation I would make then is that this is inherently good because if there's more art, it's significantly easier for conversations to occur about what kinds of trauma plot art is good and what kinds of trauma plot art is bad. With every additional piece of song, every additional piece of movie, you also have critiques by actual therapists, by psychologists that pick apart what's happening, for example, in Euphoria, that pick apart these songs and actually tell you, okay, this is real. I've actually had a client that talks about this, but this is not how, for example, the human mind actually works. These critiques are quite popular and often spread through things like social media, blog posts, and YouTube videos with real people criticizing these things. This only happens when there are many of these things, where there's lots of prominence and a lot of people buy into it. The second thing I would note is competition is inherently good. And I want to note that there are many different forms of media. There's music, documentary, films, and there's inherently, when you have more prominence, competition across all of these categories. I want to note, so government is going to be like, this competition leads to like bad incentives, and as a result, you appeal to the lowest common denominator and so on. I want to break this deadlock right up top and tell you why this competition means that we offer a nuanced perspective. A few reasons here. The first thing I would note is, this is artists, in the vast majority of instances, their own individual experiences that are being talked about, i.e. when Billie Eilish wrote about bury her friend, it was her own personal experience and what she went through. They have control over this. Their thing is, companies tell you and create the artistic direction of this and so on. But I think that's significantly much more likely to happen on their side. What the prominence of this does is that it gives individual artists more options, i.e. they can pick and choose between the least exploitative publishers. They can pick and choose between the least exploitative companies, and as a result, artists have significantly more choice. When only on their side, it's a monopoly of a few publishing houses, monopoly of a few record players, it's significantly less likely that you have good kinds of competitions and artists' individual experiences being talked about. Second, the prominence means that like we have, for example, like indie films being created, but a lot of big companies also talking about this. This is also just inherently good, because when more money is poured into it, that increases your capacity, for example, to hire writers when you're writing a movie who actually have these lived experiences, to do lots of audience like data analysis on what, for example, the people who have actually went through abuse, how they are actually like talking about it and how they are reacting to this. This uniquely is a result of the prominence of the media and art, which is why there's good competition. But the last thing I would note as to why this is inherently good competition that leads to nuanced perspectives is the kinds of audience that are likely to watch this. One, it's people who've literally faced trauma. They literally pick apart your movie, and I want to note that each individual negative review magnifies a lot, because the reviews spread like wildfire, especially on social media. All you need is somebody who might be indifferent to watching and consuming this piece of art to read somebody who actually went through trauma, picking apart it, and they're unlikely to watch it. But I want to note, no thank you, that this is not unnecessary abuse and violence precisely for the reason they identified. It might be too triggering to people. If it's too fucking grotesque, too fucking violent all the time, then people are unlikely to watch it, because people often watch art for other things, not just like, oh, I want to learn about abuse, but also for enjoyment. And as a result, they strike a balance. Their victimization argument is out because there's a fucking high cost to acting yourself as victims. I don't know why people would put themselves through that. Let's talk about societal benefits. The first thing I want to note, no thank you, is recognition of abuse is significantly better on our side. There are two problems in the status quo. The first thing is, often abuse is quite subtle, and alternative forms of media, i.e. things like video games, which also portray things like abuse and violence, just show more grotesque abuse and grotesque violence. So it's hard to find out, for example, like pieces of harassment or manipulation that are significantly more subtle. Second, people often have cognitive dissonance, i.e. they, for example, abuse, like in most cases, is magnified by somebody who you know, a friend, a partner, and so on. And as a result, you also see good sides of a person. You remember how they were like earlier, which is why recognition of abuse is harder. We solve this for two mechanisms. The first thing is, I think when you watch a show, for example, like Euphoria, you develop a relationship with the characters as well. And this is critical, because you develop that personal relationship. You're able to, for example, step into their shoes. And you also recognize, wait, fuck, their partner is abusing them. I have also seen these kinds of signs with my relationship. And that's exactly when that relatability means that you're better able to recognize abuse. But second, this sparks conversation, and this is really important. We uniquely get more conversations about abuse, which is critical, because these movies and this art can serve as a reference point, which is critical. It's harder to bring people, somebody in Bangladesh and somebody in the US, to talk about their struggles. Euphoria provides a middle ground through which you can do that. Yes?
To what extent can two people's experience, right, be the same?
No, it doesn't need to be fucking exactly the same. You just need to have similar trends, right? That's the big thing. You don't need to face the exact same thing. That's not what we're arguing. You just need to be like, okay, my partner abused me in this subtle way. Similarly subtle way, this happened in Euphoria. I think people are rational enough to draw the connection. This is really important, because recognition of abuse is the prerequisite to you getting help. Often charities themselves use these reference points. If, for example, there's a Reddit forum on Euphoria and people are talking about how they're also facing similar kinds of abuse, charities can go on these Reddit forums and provide things like targeted help, so we actually mechanize and weaponize these charities significantly better on our side. The second thing I want to note why uniquely art and media is the reason why we're able to get benefits on decreasing stigmatization, providing people comfort, making them seen, and so on. There are three things. First, media and art is uniquely accessible. This is precisely because of the reasons they give you. The fact that language, for example, is not too academic, and it's quite easy to understand what's happening. For example, and it's also just like, there are other scenes as well. For example, there'll be jokes, there'll be sex scenes, and that is important actually because this means that the prediction of violence is not too intense, so it helps you engage and disengage similarly. Secondly, media and art uniquely amplifies the strength of other sources like social media, like blog posts, like therapist psychologies. They use this in their analysis as well. And finally, media and art is quite far-reaching. It is international. It's not, for example, only a certain section of audience that hangs with each other, that has the same political views, that watches it. It transcends socio-political boundaries. That's why I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'm very happy to call the next speaker.
I think for most people, the world would be a substantially better place if they didn't believe living, breathing, and continuing a day with some degree of self-loathing is an acceptable way to continue their lives. I think I want to make two observations about our case, how it interacts with people writ large, and talk about the interactions they have with OO. Then I want to impact the stuff on victimhood and explain uniquely why victimhood gets substantially larger on their side of the house. But the idea of getting actual change isn't what they say for a number of reasons. The first thing that I want to say is I want to explain the set of unengaged with mechanisms that RP gives you that explains why economic circumstances, irrespective of this competition response that comes out of OO, still remain symmetric on both sides of the house. And it's important because it explains why stories themselves are declining in quality writ large due to the mass production of media. Not everybody is Christopher Nolan. Not everybody can call every A-lister on his cell and tell them come and pull up. And it implies that film itself has incentives structurally to be really mid, especially when they become more mass-produced world. And this is important because it means maybe competition is something that artists can take a part of, but it's likely not because the structures of big publishing houses, of Netflix, of streaming, and all of these producers stays the same. So the sort of experiences that artists get aren't true. They aren't able to leverage this in the way that they talk, and you know that it's not true because look at the massive amounts of Netflix specials that come out. They're all shit for a good reason. The second thing that this implies is this uniquely explains why trauma is going to be bad in these sorts of myths, because it implies the sorts of stories that you actually get within these are not good. And it also implies, secondarily, that when you do get these stories, the ones that are likely to put in are ones that are put in because the publisher house, whoever makes the executive that makes the final call on this is like, wow, trauma must be good, must create great incentives. The second thing that I want to point out is that the reason why it's an important mech is this, is because even if it's true in either world, and our counterfactual is one where perhaps one prominence goes down, it's a better one, because it means that there are lots of places where small film artists, absent of prominence, have positions of power that they don't get in our current status quo. Where are these places? Clearly they're film festivals, whether it's Cannes, whether it's Vienna, whether it's Toronto. All of these places are places where it's far harder to tell a good, compelling, prominent trauma story if it's the standard and status quo. If everyone looks at you like you're presenting just a sob story. And these are positions where all of the competition stuff that OO talks about become far more realized in these circumstances, where artists in these positions can take advantage of this to actually push out good trauma stories. I think this is how their mech actually works, and it doesn't work in an instance where trauma is the mass-produced sort of media that you see writ large. The second thing is irrespective of whether it's done good or well, I want to talk about now victimhood. And this, I think, directly engages with OO. We think the biggest sorts of harms that happens when these medias are the ones that you consume the most is that it changes the way that you internalize and engage with these things in your life. And it's important that you interact with this because it's important how the media directly relates to how people see themselves and what standards they set our norms are important, right? It shapes what we see as attractive, what we see as normal, what we see as things that are perhaps cool. There's a couple of problems that happen when trauma becomes writ large popular and becomes prominent. The first is that we think people are predisposed to viewing their lives through a lens of trauma. And I think the reason why they're predisposed to do so is because it comes normal. The people that succeed succeed despite their trauma are the ones that have done it through the hard work. And it becomes glamorized to do so. It becomes a good thing that you are a person who suffered a massive amount of trauma and has managed to succeed. And in the instances, by the way, where you don't succeed, where you're continuously stagnant, it's okay okay because you're someone who has faced trauma, because you're dealing with these things that are massively difficult, that are portrayed within these movies, and it's not your fault because of it. And no, this isn't to imply that people who face these things are at fault writ large. Rather, it's to say that people generally need things in their lives that push them to improve, and the normalization of this makes it far harder to do so. That's to say that generally speaking, in people's support structures, you have your friends and your family. And the problem with family is generally they are old-spirited. They aren't able to understand and experience your trauma in the same way. And maybe these movies don't bridge the gap. The reason why they're bad for your friends is because your friends feel the same emotional responses that you do. They find it harder to hold you accountable at the point at which they see you as a victim, and these stories continue to put you at this. And what it means is a unique metric that put people out of these positions where they're stuck in holes, where they're not getting out of bed in days, where they're normalizing this behavior, becomes true because of these prominence, because it becomes far harder for you to be called accountable. I think this is important because this is the first level of harm. That's to say that prominence and trauma writ large makes it far harder to hold yourself accountable and for people around you to hold yourself accountable. It means people become normalized to hating themselves every day. They become normalized to smoking a cigarette before they do anything in their lives, and the harm that it causes their lungs becomes a natural thing that they experience. And all of these things are perhaps bad. It probably isn't good that these things are things that people are okay with, that they live their lives with. We think that's the difference. And no, now I want to push against OO, because recognizing the abuse, we think, is not the first step to getting hope. And I think that's the problem that OO has. That's to say, there are critics. There are lots of people talking about it. But the things that actually get people to put themselves in positions where they have actual potentials to get better is wanting to change. It's telling stories of strife. And we think that's the comparative. That's to say that the sorts of media that are likely to be outlined, the ones that tend to be the ones that stick with you the most. And think about every major film in the last 30 years that has managed to be very emotionally compelling, whether it's Everywhere, Everything, All at Once, or whether it's Perks of Being a Wallflower. It's people reaching positions where they want to actually change, where they want to think that their lives are things that have potential to be lived for and to continue being strong. And in this incentive, it's not just recognizing abuse. It's actually wanting to deal and get better and healthier because of this. CEO.
Yeah, if I watch Perks of Being a Wallflower, will I contract clinical depression?
No, but we think you're far more likely to see patterns within these movies that make you think that this is what you're dealing with, and you're far more likely to then put yourself in positions where you might face these symptoms anyways. And the third thing about it is in instances where you do face these symptoms, you're far more likely to relate with them and get worse. Lastly, directly engaging with OO, especially on the stuff of critics. The first problem that I want to point out with this is, clearly I don't think people are good critics. I think unless you have very intimate experience with a very specific type of trauma, it's very difficult for you to materially and reasonably call out the problems within this trauma. We think the vast majority of people online are just yapping. The second thing that I want to point out here is it's probably not true that you have professional therapists on Wired that are doing these things that are reasonable commentary. Anyone can go onto these channels, and many people can just praise their commentary. There's no real legitimacy or authority check on this sort of commentary. The second issue that I think is even bigger is this, is that there is a presumption that OO makes, a presumption that I think is less important for our case, that people watch things critically, i.e. They watch these things, and they have to be very critical about this to gain a lot of the benefits. But we don't think that's true for us, because just because you have a lot more expertise and experience, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily used. Whereas for us, when you watch these shows, when you internalize them, when you walk away with them, even if you don't necessarily feel very terrible about it, all of a sudden the bad behaviors in your lives are normalized. All of a sudden these things are things that are harder for you to be like, I have to get away with because it's okay. Because being in these positions is okay, but it shouldn't be. You should be pushed to get help. You should be pushed to do better. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call the alarm.
Contrary to what OG would want you to believe, being a victim is not easy, and it is quite difficult every single day to think about something traumatic, be it your friend who took their life, be it your debate coach who took their life, or anything of the sort. But what is important is that this culture does not cause the problems that they are pointing out. This normalization gives a voice to those who already do not have a voice. And a ballot for opposition for government bench is effectively a ballot that you are clamping down on the voices of those who do not have a voice right now. This debate is about normalization of conversations that people already have in their head. This debate is about the prominence and normalization of the thoughts that people already go through on a day-to-day basis. And this is the side that is taking it away from them. This is the side that is taking away the victimhood of victims who already have it. They cannot win this debate. The first thing I want to talk about then is representation. Their claim is this will be done quite poorly and people will basically want to become victims and, smoke cigarettes or whatever that example was. 4 responses. First of all, they never proved to be the personal incentive. Why is it that an artist who themselves have gone through trauma, who themselves have gone and seen these things, who have seen the terrible nature of it, what is the incentive of them to not give a nuanced outcome? Because at the end of the day, it is Billie Eilish's song. At the end of the day, it is that author's book. What is the incentive of that individual to actually not give you a nuanced version? But secondly, you might say that, wait a minute, they also have artists on their side. Then the deadlock or the margin is the pool of artists that you get. Because on their side of the house, you necessarily have lesser artists. And don't take my word for it. Take their word for it because that's the comparative that they're trying to run anyway. But secondly, I would posit that, okay, even if an individual film is not too nuanced because you have limited time, because you have limited whatever, budget constraints and everything, the fact that you have a greater pool of movies, a greater pool of books means that the overall nuance of abuse, the definitions that we associate to abuse are far likely to expand. That is to say, even in their best case, if a particular book is not very nuanced, the fact that multiple books exist that bring multiple different experiences, and this actually deals with the COPOI as well, because yes, the experience of 2 rape victims is not the same, but that is precisely why we want more of them to give their story. So the definition that you have of abuse evolves over time. It becomes more inclusive of the people that are excluded. But thirdly, we think it creates a culture and a marketplace for these sorts of movies which doesn't exist on their side. Why is this important? 3 reasons. It flips their budget point because they very cleverly try to come up and say small movie theater people will have a place of power and everything. But that only happens in a world where the art that they specialize in, the art that they're good at, the art that they're already doing in those small theaters is something a big publisher would also want them to do because other fucking publishers are also doing the same thing. But secondly, I would posit that publishers on their side are far more exploitative and are likely to hijack victim stories. That is to say, when the prominence doesn't exist, it is a small pool of people actually making these plots and movies, which means the individual ability of a single publisher or a single movie production house to take the story from somebody is much higher. On our side, because you have more people in that pool, because you have more publishers vying for it, they are less likely to hijack it because they fear that they will go to the other production house. As a consequence of that, we do one thing that they never do. We increase the pool of stories that are coming in, and that is critical for any change in this debate because your ability to bring about change comes from your ability to recognize abuse. But if the stories of abuse are inherently limited, your ability to call out abuse does not exist. This is the prerequisite in this debate, and we get that. But fourthly, even if, let's make the even if they're right that there is somewhat terrible representation, there are 3 things I want you to note for why this argument weighs over it. First of all, it gives catharsis to the people that matter the most. That is to say, it gives catharsis to the victims who themselves are victims of abuse because they conveniently ignore them. But secondly, it also gives catharsis to people watching them. If you're somebody who is in an abusive household and you cannot talk to your friends, you cannot talk to your family, this is the unique way that you get catharsis because yes, not a lot of people can access therapy. Not a lot of people can go and talk to their friends because of the social costs that are associated with it. But they can watch this movie and every time they see it, they feel that, I am not alone. There are others that have gone through this and there are far more people out there. But secondly, we think you get the discourse you need on our side. And they make this claim for you. They actually say that, you get the language. That's precisely what we want. We want you to develop a language that you can talk to your friends about. And that's entirely Costa's argument about the reference point. So we think this is actually quite good. But more importantly, I would also posit this flips their claim on accountability. Because insofar as your ability to recognize abuse is the prerequisite to hold people accountable, we allow people to actually do it. So we have far more accountability on our side of the house as well. But thirdly, I would just posit this is much better than other mechanisms. Like, social movements are often quite technical, they use jargon, they're very academic in nature. This is much better. And I will bite the bullet. These might not be the most nuanced. They might actually pan at the lowest common denominator. But think of it, most people have short time spans anyway. You need to get that point across in some way or the other. But secondly, you're not just watching one movie, you're watching multiple movies. So your ability to define abuse becomes more cohesive, becomes more expansive. This is the groundbreaking argument in this debate because it gives you the ability to hold people accountable. Before I move on, closing.
Yeah, you say competition leads to nuanced views. Who is the average consumer of such media and why are they such a good critic between the nuanced and
No. The average individual need not be the critic that's writing it. But the fact that you have a greater pool of movies coming about means that critics of these movies are also people that you as society are more likely to listen to. That is to say, when you have more movies coming up about abuse, when you have more novels coming about abuse, you are more likely to inculcate people who are specialists in that conversation. Otherwise, you don't have much of an incentive to do that for all the structural problems that OG itself gives you. But secondly, I want to talk about the developing world and why it is uniquely good for them. That is to say, in the developing world, oftentimes talking about things like abuse, oftentimes talking about things like sexual assault is incredibly taboo, so the cost of doing it is very high. But secondly, explicit explicit laws against such speech exist. So structurally, it is very, very hard to talk about these things. Why do we think this prominence uniquely helps people in those parts of the world? First of all, a lot of the trends that you see in art and media over there come from Hollywood. They come from the Western world. Think of the fact that India is trying to export Bollywood as well. Think of the fact that Nigeria has a booming industry as well. The reason this is important is because they take inspiration from there, and as a consequence to compete in those markets, they're more likely to talk about it. But secondly, it's not explicit, and that's good, because when it is not explicit, the state's ability to clamp down on you is far, far harder. You can use symbolism, you can use subtle cues to talk about it, and this is important because if it is the case that these are the most vulnerable people who cannot structurally access any alternatives, it is for them the catharsis matters the most, because they can't go to the therapist, they can't even take their own abuser to jail or to court because the law takes it away. This uniquely empowers the most vulnerable people in the world, and if you want a numerical comparative, they are far more in number than any other stakeholder in this debate, and they are the most vulnerable because they don't have a voice. This side is taking away the voice of those who are already voiceless. We are giving them a voice, and that is why we win this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'm very happy to call back the government to continue the round.
The first claim from closing government is that this is immensely triggering for those that have traumatic pasts, and we ought not accept that. The first premise I want to prove is why it is extraordinarily difficult to opt out for those that suffer from these experiences from exposure to this kind of media. There are a number of mechanisms. The first is that these things are aggressively marketed. That is to say, as I was walking around London, you literally cannot avoid fucking posters of Blake Lively and It Ends With Us. If you were on Book Talk, you literally cannot avoid things like A Little Life and those sorts of things, because there's publishing houses which often have millions of dollars have incentives to aggressively market those things and plaster that sort of marketing everywhere they can find. Secondly, because there is a proliferation of discussion of these things on social media, not only because content creators are basically rewarded for talking about these things, insofar as if there is something that is trending, if you make a post about It Ends With Us, you are going to get bumped up to the top of the algorithm, but also it is recommended to a lot of vulnerable people who might be engaging in specific spaces, but might not necessarily want to be exposed to this sort of content specifically. Things like you might just really like books and you're on Book Talk, or you really like films and you like, you are on Twitter, film Twitter and things like that. You might want to be exposed to those sorts of things, but not necessarily want to be bombarded by information about this sort of specific content. Which is why, for example, lots of people that have traumatic past and do not want to hear about Euphoria all the fucking time had that crammed down their throats every single time they went on Instagram, every single time they went on Twitter or TikTok, even if they did not want to be exposed to that. But finally, because in friendship groups, there's far more discussion about these things, because people talk about the kinds of films that they watch. Oftentimes, pop culture is the primary thing that lots of friends bond over, which is why when you go to lunch, you're more likely to have the friends around you talking about Euphoria, especially if you believe opening opposition's analysis, which is all of them now think they're woke superheroes and they're supporting their friends because they bring this up. It's like, hey, do you want to talk about your mental illness or trauma? No, the vast majority of people don't want to talk about it, and if they want to talk about it, they'll fucking bring it up, which is why we flip opening opposition on more conversations. We think that that's bad. The comparative is very important. In the instances where people really want the kinds of catharsis that opening opposition talks about, they want to engage with specific kinds of media that deal with these narratives, they can opt into it. Even if it is something that's normalized, you can just search up recommendations. You can Google top 10 films to talk about trauma and just watch the first one that comes up. You don't necessarily need to basically have this crammed down your throat through advertising. People have fucking agency and the internet. They can probably find these things on either side of the house. So on their side, you cannot opt out, but on our side, you can opt in, and that asymmetry history is incredibly important. The impact of this is extraordinarily large. Obviously this is just very, very, very triggering to a specific subset of people, the most vulnerable actors in the debate, the most likely to re-spiral, but also is just incredibly harmful to those that have suffered from a range of trauma. The crucial reason is this. Those who suffer from traumatic pasts now feel suffocated at the point at which they cannot basically get rid of this sort of exposure. The problem with trauma is that it weighs on you all the time. It is fucking exhausting to live with trauma. It stays with you all day. It comes back to you and haunts you as you're trying to go to sleep. And so the best thing that you can give a lot of these people is a sense of reprieve. That for once in their day, when they talk to their friends, when they go outside for a walk, they don't have to deal with this. They don't have to kind of relitigate all of the terrible things that have happened to them in their lives. Giving these people breathing room is the most important impact in the debate, and the point at which you suffocate them and take away all of that breathing room, that is incredibly bad. And notably, on the weighing against opening government, this is very important. This harm occurs even if the media is done well. So we sidestep like the stupid characterization class that opening government wants, the top half wants to have. That is for 3 reasons. Firstly, insofar as you bring up this topic all the time and it's very difficult to escape, the harm of triggering occurs even if you don't see the movie, even if you don't actually open up the book in the first place. Everyone discussing this sort of content around you is just very harmful. Secondly, even if the media is nuanced, that does not necessarily mean the discussion of the media is likely to be nuanced. Even if A Little Life is nuanced and Yanya Gahara wants to talk about her own personal experiences, it's not necessarily the case that book talk, not necessarily the case that your friends discussing it are going to be literary experts and are going to talk about it in the most nuanced way possible. But thirdly, and very importantly, popular culture is often structured in particular ways, even if there are incentives to do it in a nuanced way. There are 2 characteristics I want to talk about. Firstly is that oftentimes you necessarily need to have a sense of resolution, or at least victories for the character, right? So which is why at the end of Wallflower, right, it's just like the hero's thing and you're leaning outside of the car with all of your friends that you've made and now everything is chill and okay. But that's for the reason that if you have an entire movie or entire book which is just like everything sucks, no one wants to go see that movie, especially popular audiences. But secondly, because you necessarily need to imbue the main character with a sense of agency. They are the hero of their own story. A lot of the time the plot revolves around large, radical life choices, changing and transforming your life in large ways. And even if open opposition proves positive competition exists, it is likely that these structural features of popular culture and popular media still remain. Why is this incredibly bad? It's because it means that people that suffer from the trauma but cannot access those sorts of characteristics feel incredibly guilty about it, because lots of these people are the ones that can't access to large degrees of agency, that do just need to rely on the people around them, that do just need to spend a year off doing nothing, just trying to find their own peace and basically sort things out with their life. They're the ones that don't make the most radical life decisions. They don't necessarily have the money or the networks to be able to do the kinds of things that the people in these stories do, are the ones that don't see lots of resolution or victory for large swathes of their life. And at the point at which they feel like a burden on those around them, especially given that they think that the people in life expect this of them now, they feel far, far worse. Maybe you feel this guilt to some extent on both sides of the house, but obviously this is a comparative debate, it's far more on our side. Which means that on our side, people are more likely to feel like it's okay to just rely on other people rather than acting on your own. It's okay to spend lots and lots of time not necessarily making significant life choices. Before I go on, opening.
The people who would access help independently do so on either side. Our framing is lots of people aren't just going to Google top 10 trauma films, so this advertising and prominence is good. Maybe if people open book talk less, that's fine because our impacts are more prominent.
Yeah, so the first response is that people obviously have self-preservation instincts, but I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal now. Opening opposition says this decreases stigmatization. The key problem with this is one of causality. Mainstream proliferation only occurs if there's already been normalization, so they put the cart before the horse, because large movie studios or large publishing houses aren't going to greenlight projects if they don't think that there is a sufficient appetite already in the market for this kind of content. And so there are probably exogenous forces that normalize these things on either side of the house. Things like academic discoveries about trauma, like the kinds of lasting impacts that sexual assault and harassment have on people, which trickle down through mechanisms like education, teaching children that you should treat these people with sensitivity and kindness, which calcifies into social norms of consideration. But also therapy being accessible now at an exponentially increasing rate, because people can access online therapists because it's becoming more widespread of a profession, which means that people do opt into the kinds of good things that they want on both sides of the house. The kinds of things that people can't opt out and are the most triggering are these sorts of popular culture. Weighing over an opening government, there are very few actual harms in the case. Like, the closest they get is that you normalize people rotting in bed, and that's bad. But obviously our problem is far, far worse, because obviously people that don't like to rot in bed won't want to rot in bed. On the flip side, it is very, very hard to escape the kinds of harms that we say, even if you have self-preservation instincts. For that reason, I'm very proud to govern.
Thank you very much for that speech. We're very happy to call member of the opposition to open the case for CR.
pretty crazy to me that in a media debate, nobody is really that interested in why we all like media and art. We hopefully like art because the art we engage in is actually good, and it tells interesting stories that depict things in interesting ways. Shows like The Sopranos, which were groundbreaking at the time of their creation and revolutionary, are important to the media landscape because the exploration of the trauma within them was groundbreaking and offers more space for good and interesting art, which is an independent impact from the opening half clash about whether or not this art is done well for victims. Because hopefully art is done well for victims, but we hope that art is done well and is interesting and is good for all of us so we can more importantly engage in it. Why is this more important than our opening's benefits? OO and OG hinge a lot of their impacts around the effect on the individual. But, as CG point out, people do oftentimes engage in art in different ways, and oftentimes this would only apply to a small set of people. In comparison, our impacts are much wider ranging, because if we prove to you that we are able to create better art for the masses that is more engaging for people to engage in, actually giving good art to people is oftentimes really important for their meaning and enjoyment in life overall. Firstly then, why trauma plots or adding trauma inherently oftentimes makes art more interesting, so you're in comparison to comparative. Why do these stories allow for more interesting exploration of art? A, because you're often pushed more to do more allegorical work because these emotions are harder to understand. For example, doing a story or a poem about depression, which is oftentimes an experience that people find difficult to understand or incredibly upsetting in comparison to something like comedy, is often more common because you have to find new ways to express emotions that you don't immediately understand or are incredibly impactful on your life. But secondly, emotional depth pushes artists on large to engage with more difficult experiences or evaluate them more critically because they have had such a huge impact individually on their own lives, which pushes them to make more interesting critiques on it or spend more time on their work of art. The outcome of this is that you can do more interesting work on this. How then do people create more interesting art through trauma plots in comparison to comparative? A, because the story itself is so sad, it means you have to add things that are more creative on top of it in order to draw audiences in. For example, Euphoria is groundbreaking in media for doing interesting work on set design and makeup, and it has pushed the boundaries on what people are able to do to this. You specifically need trauma in order to do this as a way to draw people in. Otherwise, if I'm just watching Euphoria, I'm legit just watching teenagers die in an overdose or just watching incredibly traumatic experiences again and again, which means trauma specifically pushes people to make more interesting, creative decisions around the trauma to be able to make a comment of this. In comparison, we think the comparative is more shows like sitcoms or shows that don't engage as much with these traumatic emotions that people often face, which necessarily are always going to draw more people in because of being able to make people laugh or make people feel good. So in comparison, you make more interesting art there. Secondly then, the narrative allows for more complex emotional depth within the narrative, within the story itself. Trauma often makes people really awful and bad to the people around them and makes them do terrible things. If someone who has depression or has had bad things happen to them makes bad decisions. But secondly, oftentimes they have had terrible things happen to them in order to make them that way. This is why shows like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad are so popular and were seen as such landmark shows of television, because they had incredibly interesting narrative depth around trauma, because this trauma specifically allowed for more exploration into, for example, Walter White's mind and why he's like that, which means in more pieces of art, you just do head to more interesting places than on the comparative that explores less sad or traumatic emotions. But see, you just do have more boundary-breaking forms and more non-linear art forms. For example, as I referenced, abstract art or more upsetting emotions, because there are emotions people tend to be less familiar with or make a huge impact on people's lives, which do upset people. Why do you need specifically prominence then to create more groundbreaking art? A, you just expose more artists and more people towards these forms of media, which inspires people to do more. If you have one groundbreaking show like The Sopranos, we are now able to get more groundbreaking shows surrounding trauma or make more interesting art, which inspires people. But secondly, it just is a benefit in itself to have more interesting art. The impacts of this are that art just gets better at the point in which you give people more avenues to explore more interesting emotion, and this is the norm in which people work with. It touches more people every day to have shows that are interesting to work with and interesting to explore. Second extension then on why this allows individuals to explore their own emotions through art. Firstly, to explaining why they wouldn't otherwise. I just think there are competing norms around what people should do to explore their trauma. Should you go to a therapist, for example, or talk to your friends, which suggests that exploring it through art and media is not the first step that people would go to without the prominence of trauma in this. But B, it just is a benefit in itself because it pushes more people into doing this. Why is art and media the best form of people to explore their trauma? Or it's important to allow this as an option. A, because it is more individualized than oftentimes talking to a friend and is more private, which means you can go through your emotions at your own pace or at your own pace and explore it in different ways. But B, allowing people to express their emotions through art is something which is seen as incredibly cathartic for people. And if this is not a norm, you are not able to encourage this. So why is this more important than what opening opposition tells you? Because opening opposition's impacts are contingent on how victims internalize this. Allowing the artist itself to access these benefits are important. Opening.
So your mechanisms about creativity are only true when trauma is the centerpiece of a very long story, not when it's used as a tool to slap onto characters or...
But surely this norm means that it often is the centerpiece of a story, right? Like, I think that's how it operates. Firstly, rebuttal to closing government. Their extension, I think, is a bit bonkers. Firstly, if you just think it triggers most people, I think most of the media surrounding this, like, it ends with officers like, let's put images of Blake Lively getting beat on the street. It was oftentimes just the person in the image. I don't understand how this is triggering. But secondly, the friends who talk about this, like, presumably your friends are like, oh, this person went for domestic abuse. I'm going to bring up a conversation about the domestic abuse show that came up. These are the people that are most likely to know about what things you went through. But see, even if you think you engage in online media and that's how you get exposed to it, that's where you have the most control over what you can see. You can block people on social media incredibly easily. You can exit out of social media spaces incredibly easily as well. It is so unclear to me by seeing one tweet that is like, Skylar White is a bitch, is just going to make you spiral into you getting trauma-filled. It is far more better that you are able to get more important art that every person can access and enjoy. I love shows like The Soprano and Breaking Bad and Mad Men. So proud to affirm.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call the government to hear here.
Cool. Ready? The thing about media is that it is often pervasive, and for the people who have experienced the literal worst things that can happen to them, showing it everywhere, on every TV, on every piece of like a poster around, is probably one of the most triggering things that can happen to them. They say, oh, you can block the people, but like, can you go and block everyone that creates on this? You don't control the algorithm that most of these social media platforms shows you, and crucially, you don't know how gory a movie is gonna be before you have seen the movie. So it's not like you're some mastermind that knows exactly how this movie is gonna deal with the triggering experience before you've seen it. That rebuttal is bizarre. The first thing I'm gonna do is take out closing opposition from this debate, because the main crux of their extension is that this makes people create more interesting art, and that's a benefit for presumably everyone. Probably fair enough, but 3 points of observation. 1, I would argue all artists want to create interesting art because the media landscape is saturated, artistic integrity does matter, and most of them do get their kicks out of feeling like they have innovated something, no thank you, sit down. And as a result, it just means that whether you are a sculptor sculpting frogs or whether you create in this, you are incentivized to make something creative. Secondly, you can have deep psychological explorations without centering your narrative on trauma. Arguably, The Sopranos, which is literally their main example, is primarily a gangster show that has a character that deals with depression but isn't centered on it. You can have a lot of the exploration of the deep, meaningful emotions absent these tropes. And thirdly, and most importantly, I would actually think the opposite is true. I think this makes the artists, the shows, less creative, because absence the prominence of this trope is when you're challenged to generate new, meaningful ways of engaging with experiences. It's when you're challenged to try different sort of mediums. It's when you're challenged to push the boundaries. It is not when you know that there's a prominent thing that if you do, you're going to sell, and that's it. That out, most of their impacts, no thank you, are just non-symmetric and apply across the board for every team in this debate. If not, they actually make it significantly worse. Now, for opening government to get their case, they rely on a pretty bizarre characterization of these art pieces. To buy them, you have to believe, one, that they are mostly about the subplots, not about the plots, hence you don't get the legitimate time to deal with these things. Two, that you don't get character and innovation plots. And three, that the roles of writers and publishing houses are so fixed that there's no negotiation between them, that the writer is pretty much this minion who is used and abused. These are all correct initial barriers that everyone in the industry faces, but as the entirety of the opposition bench points out, there seem to exist in the world competing incentives to sort these out, to which opening government has virtually no response. So we take over them because our case is not reliant on any of these premises to be activated in to begin with. The second thing that is really important from opening government is that this creates a culture of victimhood because people think it's okay to be a victim. Sure, that is correct, but ask yourself how large of an impact that is. Most people who experience symptoms of something usually have that something. Placebo is not that big of a thing as opening government tries to frame it. So if you actually think about it, yes, some people probably will experience those victim effects, but a majority of people that actually viscerally experience those feelings, that actually have viscerally gone through those experiences, are victims and probably should think of themselves as victims to cope over, which is the vast majority of people that we talked about. The last impact, no thank you third, that remains from opening government is art is going to be done badly because it reinforces stereotypes. Look, I know we love stock analysis, but you've got to be asking yourself at one point in debates, what the fuck does it mean? Why is bad art so bad? Why do I care about that? Who exactly suffers? Why is that such a big deal? The only speaker on government bench who has actually emphasized the true effect of these things on tangible people and society is Aiden, when he explains to you who watches these things, how they engage with it, why they have no ability to often opt out of these things, and why that is incredibly pervasive on them. Both because we don't need their premises, both because we apply to a significantly far larger of people, and both because those people are the most important agents in this debate, is why we take over opening government. Opening opposition, then, beforehand, go.
If you're triggered by one movie, you just won't watch the next movie about abuse because you were triggered, but our impacts on recognition and conversation are uniquely the most certain impacts in this round.
Yeah, so I'll deal with conversation obviously after, but the main response I'll say here is once again, how do you know? Like you don't know to what extent that thing is going to target the abuse in the way you say. You won't know all of those things, but I'll now talk about conversations as well. The first thing they say is that because of competition, you're going to get more art, and as a result of that, stories will be better and more nuanced. Obviously, the first thing to say is that we don't really rely on this for our extension to kick in, but I do actually think this is an incorrect claim. And I think this is just like a classic stock mechanism of, oh, competition good, that we all kind of import from econ debates. But ask yourself, panel, who is this competition? Who are the agents through which competition kicks itself? Because it's usually 5 publishing houses that dominate the market that all look pretty much the same, that have boards that look pretty much the same, that have very similar appetites for risk, and that dominate usually the industry in a lot of ways. The point of this is that just because you have competition doesn't mean that's going to be meaningful competition if the profiles of those competing are incredibly similar. And then they say, no, but people will criticize you on social media, which totally ignores how these industries operate to begin with. The philosophy of most of these publishing houses is any publicity is good publicity, which is why the producers of It Ends With Us pretty much enjoyed all of the criticisms, because it means that the people who are sheep went to the movies and saw those people and engaged with their content, and they make their money. The second thing they say is that people feel seen and victims think heard. One, think about the main characters in these art pieces. They're usually somewhat rich, educated white women who are probably very hot, or men who are very smart. A majority of people don't go through these experiences, face financial, social constraints to leaving their abusers and to being the empowered character that these films portray them. But two, most of the people who suffered from trauma don't want everyone to talk about it. They don't want to be these heroes put on a pedestal, who are in the limelight all the time. This is because it's the most upsetting feeling that you can't escape your trauma and that it will guide your life for the rest of it. Then finally they say what is left of them is that you're going to have conversations. Importantly here, conversations are driven by the opinions people already have. If you put a movie in progressive London, the conversation is going to be good. If you put it in a random Eastern European town, it's going to be bad. For them to have the delta, you have to believe that people significantly change all of their life experiences that they bring to the conversation to begin with. Conversation in itself is not a net good. The crucial way is OO maybe helps some people to feel seen marginally. We help a far wider amount of people to not be triggered every day. For all of those reasons, closing government.
Euphoria was nominated for, and actually won, the Emmy. BoJack Horseman has now been nominated for, I think, 4 or 5 daytime Emmys. And the album that Bury a Friend was in by Billie Eilish also won the Grammy that year. And I explain that to you to prove 2 things. The first thing it proves is that on net, this sort of media is done really fucking well. The second thing is that it proves that it's good quality art, independent of the trauma that exists within it, and independent of the impact that it has on the individuals that watch it. There's a reason why I watch Euphoria. I don't have a drug addiction. I don't experience clinical depression. And I enjoy it. I think the aesthetic is really beautiful. I think the hair and the makeup is phenomenal to look at. And the reason why Euphoria uses things like hair and makeup and things like set design and that aesthetic is because it wants people to watch a show they otherwise might feel too upset to watch without this, but also because it's really hard to explain things like drug addiction without having the interesting aesthetic tunnels that it uses to represent things like the experience of being on LSD. I have never done LSD. I think I can maybe have some level of understanding having watched Euphoria now. Opening opposition will win this debate on the impact on individuals. We're going to win this debate on art, and maybe that is bold to say at closing opposition whip, but that is just how this debate should be read. And let me explain that why that is to you, panel. Our extension proves that these shows have value independent of the impact it has on the individuals watching them because the art in it is inherently interesting to look at. Opening opposition do not explain to you what these shows actually fucking look like. And importantly, the artistic ways in which they're uniquely able to do things like represent trauma. This goes further than their economic analysis as to why there are incentives to make these shows well by proving that the reason why you lean on the specific artistic elements of creativity is because there aren't other ways for you to represent trauma in particularly dynamic and diverse ways. But secondly, we transcend the opening half clash by taking on just a much lower burden. Opening is concerned with the impact at an individual level. We explain this art is impactful independent of that. This is both, one, through the forms of creativity that are exclusively enabled by things like trauma plots. For all the other reasons opening government lists to you as to why it's really hard to be nuanced are reasons why they must lean on them. That is why things like Euphoria use makeup. It's also the reason why BoJack Horseman uses animation. Obviously, I am not a horse, but I can experience mental health issues. And importantly, panel, the reason why they did that is it allowed them to stream BoJack Horseman in the US at an earlier time slot because it wasn't rated R, because it used animated form. forms. That is why you get more pervasive interpretations of trauma, because people just can now buy into them because of the way that they're uniquely represented. Watching these shows otherwise would be really sad. This is why people want to buy into them regardless. And importantly, panel, maybe this is a flippant response, but if you credit opening government's claim that's like you will now get depression from watching these shows, that is just ludicrous. Maybe you get buy-in from different individuals watching them. I think that's a benefit. We co-opt at closing opposition. Elena says, well, actually, the examples we point to don't display depression. That is uncharitable. The responses from closing government by almost their entirety are. I'll deal with them in a second. But secondly, these things are just valuable in that they indicate the artistic purposes of media, and these lead to creative, new wave developments in film media. Panel, this topic exists only now because trauma media is a trend of the last 20 years in which we have diversified the way that we represent media. Prior to this, you had hand-in-hand explanations that allowed the most low barrier to entry voter to understand what your shows were. These shows are innovative, they are unique. They are not understood by every single person in society, but that is the value of art. That is the reason why streaming has proliferated, because the funding into new wave elements has increased. That is why small creators are able to do what they want. But secondly, even if you don't believe art is good, we explain this is also good for creators because they are able to actualize their experience in individually fulfilling ways, which is incredibly important. Proliferation means you get more funding and less stigma. That means a pretentious fucking liberal arts college graduate can make a short film about their individual trauma. If you care about individuals on government, you all care about the individuals that can now buy into making the stories they care about. We co-opt government on their best metric in this debate. Elena says two things. One, without this, you would need to find new forms of media that could be otherwise interesting. That's just uncomparative with the status quo. Like, the reason why we introduced the trauma plot and we introduced the ways in which we represent it was to challenge untraditional forms of media that weren't interesting. I'm not sure government has ever seen a film. Secondly, Elena says, well, this is you can represent art in other ways with different stories that don't necessarily need to be traumatic. That is unresponsive. All of the mechanisms Eleanor gives you as to why you necessarily need trauma to unlock this type of creativity that allows you to do things in a more innovative fashion. Let's talk about closing government. I have 5 responses to their claims. Firstly, the way in here is just some people who already recognise their trauma feel triggered. They are just a less vulnerable actors than the people who don't know they're going through trauma. This responds to Aiden's mechanism of allowing people to opt in. The reason why they don't opt in on fucking CG is they don't know they're going through trauma, so you would never be able to opt in. That is the prerequisite to accessing their benefit. Secondly, these movies are marketed with nuance. There was a trigger warning at the start of Blake Lively's, but also importantly, they partner with donation partners. That is why Dear Evan Hansen raised the most amount of funds for anti-depression funds as it was released, because it had trauma in the story. That is why it ends with us partnered with an anti-domestic violence clinic to get women support. Importantly, at their best, these movies are marketed in ways where you don't know there is trauma. That is a good thing, because that is a woman that can now go and see It Ends With Us because her husband thinks it is a romance story, and she can understand the abuse that she's facing at home. That is the benefit, even if we take them at their best. Opening.
Our impact on victimhood normalization, A, is true even if the art is done well, and B, applies to everyone who engages with that art, not just victims of specific severe trauma.
Sure. Panel, at their best, someone like fucking gets depression because they watch a depression movie. I just don't understand opening government's arguments. That is an uncharitable, speculative harm in the debate. Our claim is people recognise their abuse because they go to see movies. Like, sure, whip your argument, but not an amazing argument. Third response from CG. It's possible to remove yourself from spaces. That's okay. If this is the worst harm CG stakes their case on, having to have a discussion about trauma that you feel uncomfortable with, I just don't think that's a debate-winning burden for them. Fourthly, these shows don't always have positive endings. I'm not sure if Aiden's finished Perks of Being a Wallflower, but I encourage you to watch the last 10 minutes because it's not that fucking happy. Fifthly, at their best, someone doesn't know what they're getting into, but this is obviously only triggering insofar as you recognise it in yourself. If you feel triggered, that is what tips you over the point of seeking help. That is how we get the tipping point on side closing opposition if you care about victims. Panel, at the end of the debate, you should care about individuals, but you should also care about the quality of art. Government bench is out, so happy to oppose.